New year, new league. The Fantasy Ruckers are back for 2024 for another exciting fantasy MLR season. There are new faces in new places. So, on this episode, we take an early glimpse at the rosters heading into MLR 2024 and catch up on all the exciting breaking news that happened over the holiday break. The Fantasy Rucker Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 90 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. And our mission goes on for another year here, Maddie. 2024 is here. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Happy New Year to all of our viewers on YouTube. But 2024 is here and means the MLR 2024 season is that much closer. Another fantasy season is right around the corner.
Yep, it's been a while. So happy holidays, to everybody out there, all the listeners. Happy New Year, like you said, Rye. And another thing, darn Rye, we are 10 episodes away from episode 100. And that is, I'm trying to think about it, 10 weeks from now, that is almost going to align pretty close with the draft time, Some of our draft spectacular maybe during that time. And it's going to align with the season starting. So, hey, we're running with good time here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Fantasy Ruckers are back after a short little holiday break there. And Matt, I'm pretty sure you mentioned it the last episode we did. It's always the MLR that decides to do a whole bunch of stuff when we decide to take a break. And there's been no shortage of things that have happened over the course of the past month that we got to break down, catch up on this episode. Because, man, when you look at Major League Rugby and how it looks like going into the 2024 year, it looks like a brand new league.
Yeah, let me start off with this, Ryan, before we get into things, and maybe this is kind of a segue into our news and notes, but I gotta take one on the shins here, Ryan. I gotta say sorry. I gotta say sorry to the league.
Sorry.
I underestimated them.
That's true.
I said before the break, we went into the break, we're not getting an LA team. We're not getting an LA team. And what do? They prove me wrong. And they decide to put it right into my face and say, you stare at this phallus-looking logo, and you stare at the worst name that's ever come to the MLR. And we had the Giltinis and the Go-Gronies, and they said, we're definitely having an LA team this year. We'll get into it more, but I just wanted to start off the new year, Ryan, with a bit of forgiveness.
Well,
not forgiveness, I guess sympathy.
Yeah, well, I guess a funny thing there too is that, Matt, I know you talked about how big you are on teams releasing their full rosters, and
they did that.
And they did that. You may not be happy with their name, you may not be happy with their logo, but at the very least, Matt, they're trying to appease you by coming out with a clear and concise roster for you. So
they've got male genitalia as a logo.
But hey, we'll get into it. We'll get into all of our concerns about the LA team. But yeah, we got a whole bunch to catch up on this episode. Obviously, a whole bunch of roster moves happening. We haven't been on the show since the dispersal draft has happened. Nope. There's also some rumblings about a possible 12th team entering the league, which is pretty crazy to think about as well after everything that has gone on towards the tail end of the 2023 year, losing Toronto, losing New York. So there is some news on that front as well. Very recent, hot off the press. And of course, in this episode, now that we've had the dispersal draft, now that we have some movement of players, we're going to have an early look, like I said at the top of the show, of what these teams look like and our opinions on them, especially from a fantasy perspective, and start deep diving into kind of some of these new faces that are on these new teams and how this changes the opinion of our thoughts on these teams and how they're going to perform. Because I think there's a whole bunch of teams that have acquired some players, that have got some new names on that list, especially after the folding of Toronto and New York, that may shift our thoughts and our outlook on them for the 2024 year. So we're going to get into all of that in this episode. But like we say every single show, we're back. And if you aren't already, maybe for the top of your 2024 resolutions,
Mm.
Go give us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers. The 2024 Fantasy MLR season is just around the corner, and hey, we've been saying it for a long, long time. Our goal here, especially in this upcoming season, is to open it up to everyone out there, and we're getting closer and closer to that reality. So you will want to be on our socials to figure out when that happens. Join us on our Discord community as well. You can find that link down below in the description,
Yep.
and you can also take an early
And
look at some of the fantasy numbers as well on the fantasyruckers.com. But yeah, we're super excited for this upcoming year. It's getting closer and closer, and hopefully we're gonna have a whole bunch of people playing fantasy
yeah.
MLR in this upcoming year, which is gonna be super exciting to see.
And hey, it's that time, Ryan. Pre-draft, analysis, pre-draft
This is where it
advice
begins.
coming from. This is where it begins. This is where the good stuff starts, and you're gonna want to be along with us for the ride.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's dive right into it, Maddie, and let's start getting into some of this breakdown here to kind of give our fantasy managers a little early outlook into what this 2024 year is going to look like.
Yep.
But we got to get through some news and notes first here. And I
Yep.
think the biggest news that we kind of got to get through here is the crazy news. And I mentioned it early at the start that obviously there was a whole bunch of turmoil that happened with this league. The unexpected loss of the Toronto
Mhm.
Arrows, the unexpected loss of the New York Ironworkers, and the future looked so grim for the MLR with all the changes that they had to do, the league structure format that they had to do. They came out with the original kind of format, and the teams folded. They had to pivot to something else here. But it looks like there's a little bit of positive news coming through here, and it might be the most positive news that we've heard here with the MLR in
Well,
quite a while. But here, there seems to be a possible 12th team that will be joining the 2024 year. You know what they say, Matt? I guess it's better late than never. We're only about 3 months away from the start of the 2024 year, but why not
yep.
add another team here to kind of balance things out after what the MLR went through? But it looks like Charlotte may be joining the MLR for the 2024 year. It sounds like they will possibly be called the Charlotte Hawks. But what is interesting about this is its affiliation with the USA Eagles and the backing that it is going to have from World Rugby. Obviously, we all know that the Rugby World Cup is coming to the United States in 2031. It sounds like this is an effort on the World Rugby side of things to pump in some more money to continue the development here and hopefully get rugby within the North Americas back on track after everything that happened
Yeah.
during the tail end of last year.
Yeah, no, this is really, it's great to see that World Rugby is taking an interest. I'm sure that this has to do with the Rugby World Cup in 2032 or whatever,
2031. Yep.
2031 that's coming to the US. And this is going to be great for USA Rugby. I mean, they're going to have guys that are going to be playing together all year round. Yeah, it's not going to include some of the Eagles guys, but that's not the point. It's supposed to be a development squad. It's going to include a lot of the guys, the young guys that maybe haven't gotten playing time in the MLR previously. Um, and yeah, it's going to give them playing time against some high level competition and some not just domestic competition, but international competition as well. I think this is great. I think this is going to be interesting to see how they fit into the season. I personally think that this team's going to have a tough time being successful in this league. I think just the MLR teams are just too good. And I don't think that they're going to be able to compete. But regardless, it'll be a way for them to play against higher level talent. It'll be a way for them to train together all year round. And yeah, I think it's great for US Rugby.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Matt, the primary purpose of this Charlotte team will be to develop U.S. eligible players, with the ultimate goal of both short-term qualification for the 2027 World Cup and
Mhm.
the long-term, like we mentioned, looking ahead to that 2031 World Cup that will be hosted here in the United States. It's
Yeah.
following kind of the same concept of what the USA Hawks were doing. It was a kind of a
Yep.
USA development side, and it looks like they're kind of going to be using this Charlotte Hawks team in the MLR to do what you're saying, Matt, to kind of give guys that are young in the kind of US circuit development program, give them playing time against high level international talent in the MLR year round, which should be only beneficial. What I think is going to be really, really interesting is kind of the stark contrast. Obviously, there was an emphasis on this when it came to talking about some of the teams that had left the MLR in Toronto, right? The Toronto Arrows, their emphasis was kind of, this was their version of, Canada's side of things, to develop Canadian rugby players
Mhm.
through this Toronto Arrows side and use that to kind of propel Rugby Canada forward here, when it comes to skill level, when it comes to development and things like that. It's going to be interesting to see. People kind of argue there's a debate whether or not how successful the Arrows were in terms of doing that for Canada. Obviously, it felt
Yep.
like Canada was kind of taking a step back, with the non-qualification for the most recent World Cup, and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how the U.S. approaches this Charlotte Hawks side and how beneficial this is going to be for USA Rugby as a whole.
Yeah, and I think the difference here is that this isn't going to include the Eagles, the Christian Dyers of the world, the Benjamin Panassos, the Dylan Fawcett's, all those guys. This isn't going to include them. Those guys are going to be playing on successful franchises in the MLR. This is going to be simply just the USA Hawk development guys. And I think it's important that they have that separate, because it doesn't mean that the high level Eagles guys, the guys who are the top players on the Eagles side, are going to have to be playing this kind of they're going to be playing losing rugby essentially. So it's good that they're out there. I think it's really great that they have this separate development side. I'll be interested to see who's on this team, because when you look at MLR rosters, I mean, you look at guys like Max Schumacher, Sebastian Villani,
Yep.
even, guys who have made a statement in this league like Colin Gross, who has gotten playing time. But these guys have all been drafted from the collegiate draft. And you wonder, I mean, those guys, those top development guys are not available to the Hawks. They're signed with squads.
Yeah.
So what happens there? Does Max Schumacher, if you realize he's not getting playing time, do they allow, is that something where US might allow him to leave and play for the Hawks? I don't know. But I think what they're doing here is really great. You brought up Canada, Ryan. And I'm actually, the first thought in my mind was, why, you lose Toronto Arrows. Why wouldn't you have something like this and what, maybe not just World Rugby, asking World Rugby to invest in, but why wouldn't this be something that you'd want to have in Canada as well? You just launched your professional team. The only Canadian development side is Pacific Pride that plays in the BC Premier League. The BC Premier League, frankly, is not the MLR. And why wouldn't you want something like this to replace, at least be some sort of replacement for the Arrows? It's not a franchise. It's a development side that's playing in a professional league that is going to be backed by World Rugby. Did they even ask? I don't know. I don't know all the answer to all those questions, but I think this would have been something that I would have loved to also see Canada take part in.
Sure.
If they don't plan on having a franchise anytime soon.
Yeah. But I mean, bottom line being is that it is encouraging to see, at least from an MLR point of view, it is encouraging to see that World Rugby sees the benefits, and obviously that has to do with them hosting the World Cup in 2031, but sees the benefits of developing rugby here on North American soil.
I don't
and
know,
seeing them making a significant investment. You don't think so?
I think what World Rugby's scared of is that 2032, you come to America,
2031.
they host 2031, they host the World Cup, and USA Rugby goes 0-4 in pool stages. They're 0-3. They lose every match and they're out. Why would you ever bring the Rugby World Cup back to America if they're not even going to win a game in pool stages? Like, I think that's what they're worried about, and I think that's the only reason. I don't think they have the interest of like US Rugby in mind. I think it's hey, we all got America to be hosting a World Cup. We better put them in the best position to try and bring the American fan base and North American fan base into it leading up to that World Cup.
Sure. I mean, no question. This investment is not happening if US is not hosting a World Cup in 2031. Of course, I agree with that. But whether it's for good intentions or whether it's for, concerning intentions, money is funneling into US Rugby for the next, 6-7 years. Right. True. So at the very least, right, we're having investment coming in. It comes at a time that was very concerning for Major League Rugby with the departure of two teams. If you would have told me, 2-3 months ago that, the MLR would be back at 12 teams, I would have laughed at you with how things were going here. But the fact that, we saw the news that we'll get into with Los Angeles finally coming to fruition with the movement from Atlanta. We're seeing Miami kind of, put more out there and we're seeing them kind kind of moving along here and solidifying their name here in the MLR. And then now you're seeing a Charlotte team that is potentially going to be joining the 2024 year. It's encouraging
Yeah,
to see. I
it
think from
is.
where we were at the tail end of 2023, and you can take a look at our last two episodes when we were talking. It was literally the New York Ironworkers departure, and then it was the Arrows departure before that.
Hmm.
The sentiment and the feeling on this show was grim. It was tough, and I think
Yeah.
they've taken a pretty big U-turn here. That there is now a
So
positive vibe and a
yeah,
positive feel
I'm
heading into 2024.
and I didn't go through the full American Rugby News article. That's on me. But I wonder, what is their position in the league in terms of next year's draft? What is their position in the league in terms of trades, signings? What does that look like? Is it just development side? So they're not making any signings. All they're doing is just bringing players through the pathway. Is bringing players through the pathway then taking away from the collegiate draft? Because those guys in the collegiate draft should technically
Sure.
be in this USA
Right.
Hawks pathway,
Right.
unless they're coming from Canada. And then can they trade salary cap considerations for, a guy like Max Schumacher, a guy like Sebastian Villani? Can they say, hey, we need these guys getting playing time. We need to bring these guys through and find some way. So do they act like that? That'll be interesting. I would love to take a fantasy look at this, Ryan, and say, hey, what does this look like fantasy wise? I mean,
Right.
I personally think that this team is not going to be guys you're going to want to be picking up. I don't think they're going to have success in this league. I think they're going to be, we brought up the Arrows. I think they're going to be similar to the Arrows last year, except maybe worse. So yeah, I don't think these guys are going to have a lot of fantasy impact. But hey, it's a bigger pool of players for us to choose from when you're desperate.
For me, this is where the conversation begins. That argument between opportunity and skill level, right? There were players that had value on the Arrows last year in
Yeah,
fantasy. There were players on the Dallas Jackals that had value. There were players on the Chicago Hounds that had value. They were not necessarily the best sides, but you had guys on there that were starting, 70 to 80 minutes every match that,
yeah,
yeah, they were not giving you outstanding numbers, but there was fantasy relevancy there. And I think there's going to be guys on this Charlotte Hawks team that are going to be like that. The whole team is not going to be on, people's rosters, but I think there's going to be streaming guys. There's going to be a select few guys here that are going to have solid opportunity and will be on the field enough that they're going to provide some sort of fantasy value.
yeah,
Again, I don't think in our drafts are they any of these guys going to be drafted high or any of that. But I think there will be guys that will be looked at because of the opportunity that they'll have. And I mean, we'll see. And kind of getting to your logistics stuff, Matt. There's still a lot to kind of, iron out here and figure out.
hmm,
Again, there has been no official announcement yet by MLR that this
true.
is something that is coming into the league at this point of the release of the podcast. We will see whether or not we've heard from sources that this announcement is supposed to be coming up in the next handful of days or so. So we'll see what more information we get from that. But I think that's a huge question, Matt, the logistics behind it in terms of what players are going to be available for this team, who's going to get
Yeah,
drafted. Because if you have a guy like Sam Gola, right, who's available for the Charlotte Hawks team, you know what I mean? Then he's a guy that might be there. But again, it's the draft between signings, all of that. But again, I think bottom line here, very reassuring that we're going to possibly see a 12th team at a time when we saw there was only going to be, as few as, 10 teams in this league. And with not the for sure knowing of Los Angeles coming in. And we kind of mentioned it and talked about it last episode, Maddie. From a fantasy perspective, when you're trying to play and navigate in a league that only has 10 teams, it's tough because there's only so
yeah,
many starters within the MLR that you'll be feeling comfortable to put on your fantasy side. Now back at 12 teams, it kind of gives you a
yeah.
little bit of that breathing room once again, which is a reassuring thing. Any last things on the Charlotte Hawks before we move on here?
No, I think that's it. I think it'll be interesting. I think I'm excited to see when it's announced, what roster is announced, and then I'm excited to kind of see, hey, how does this play into fantasy? How is this going to change the way that I pick guys and how guys look at the waiver wire? Because I think a lot of these guys are going to be on the waiver wire,
Hmm.
And I'm hoping that, like you said, right, we're going to see guys with opportunity potentially surprise a lot of the fantasy managers this year.
For sure. All right. Well, let's get into the little bit of the conversation that we're getting to about the folding of the Toronto and New York franchises led to this dispersal draft that happened that
Yep.
occurred during our break here at the Fantasy Ruckers. And since then, that dispersal draft happening, it looks like about 16 out of the 30 players to date have been drafted to or have been signed by a team, not necessarily the team that drafted them, which we'll get into a little bit here. But it does look like more and more players have been, getting put onto their respective teams and are finding homes for their 2024 year. Just before we get into kind of some of the nuances of it, Maddie, overall thoughts on the dispersal draft for me, I thought a whole bunch of names were kind of going in an order that I didn't expect it to go in. Like I did
Yep.
not expect Tyler Wong, to be going
No.
number one overall in the dispersal draft. I don't know what the kind of the ideology behind that was. And then it's been interesting watching where these players have ended up. Obviously, there's been a discussion about, Nola trading for that 6th pick, drafting Nate Oxberger, and then not actually ended up getting him in the end. It's been funny, or it's been, I should say, interesting to watch this kind of play out and how the dispersal draft impact has kind of rippled out here at the start of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was done the same way that we've seen all these dispersal drafts done in the past, very much under the radar, very much a bit confusing, not really understanding the decisions being made. But when you really look at the nuances of it, look, I'm sure they're looking at, okay, who's actually going to be realistically willing to sign with us?
Mm-hmm.
You look at Nola, they must have had some sort of reassurance from Ed Fido to say, hey, look, yeah, I'm going to sign with you. Draft me at 5. And he must have told all the other teams ahead, say, if you draft me in the dispersal draft, I'm not going to sign with you.
Right.
So kind of interesting. I wonder, you
How
look
many
at
of
the
those
rules
conversations were happening
Yeah.
beforehand. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's weird to me, right? When I saw Tyler Wong and Mitch Richardson name at the top of the draft, when there were just so many guys on there. Like how many of there was like, okay, yeah, like Ed Fido saying, I'm not going to Dallas Jackals. You don't draft me there. It's interesting.
Yeah, and then you look at guys like, Andrew Coe going in like the 3rd round. It's
Right.
like, in what world is he supposed to be going in the 3rd round?
Right.
Like, I don't know how this works. I don't know. I don't understand. I have no clue. You're right. The order is all messed up. I wonder how many mind games are played in terms of, look, Nola drafting Nate Oxberger and saying, all right, I know you're not going to sign with us. We'll try our best. But if you don't, then somebody's going to have to pay you the salary cap.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
It's going to have to go against the salary cap. I wonder how much that went. And, the other thing is like, there's also these like passes from teams. Like, why would you pass?
Right.
What would be the reason to pass? Why wouldn't you just draft somebody anyways? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
This is super weird. It all came out from the insiders, Ryan. This league literally runs on insiders, aka like Brian Ray and Jam Delay and like Rugby like it runs on insiders. They share the information and we just 90% of the time it's true.
Yeah. Well, that is an interesting point here. I think one thing to note is that if and we'll get into some of these players as we get into the team breakdown, but if a player decided to not sign with the team that drafted them in this dispersal draft, that team received salary cap considerations in exchange for the signing rights to that player. So, for example, Nate Oxberger obviously eventually signing with the Chicago Hounds. The Chicago Hounds, if I'm understanding this correctly, had to give the Nola Gold salary cap considerations for this upcoming year in exchange for the signing rights to Nate Oxberger there. So there was some kind of benefit there. Again, like you're saying there, Matt, like maybe that was kind of the inside mind game of Nola Gold.
Yeah.
To say, hey, we could do our best to sign one of the best players in the MLR. And if not, the very worst, we're getting salary cap considerations. But then that goes to the point again, Matt, of why wouldn't you just draft guys? You know what I mean? Have their signing rights.
Guys,
So it's interesting. But we'll get into kind of the results here as we go into the team breakdown and preview here of kind of how things played out. But yeah, I guess overall thoughts of just the dispersal draft that we were thinking was just, it was weird. It was interesting to see kind of where guys went. So
it was just a way to get players out. I don't really care. At the end of the day, the signing still had to be announced. And I think on a positive note, we ended up in a good place. I look at the teams now. I look at the rosters now. It was, I think the way that they've been dispersed across the league has been great. It's great to see some of these players in new jerseys, and I think it kind of has changed the outlook for some of these teams. Like one specifically, Nola Gold. I think you look at Nola Gold differently before and after the dispersal draft. So, yeah, I on a positive note, I like the way that it went. Still a lack of transparency in some ways, but it is what it is. I don't think we're ever going to get transparency with just the nuances of MLR announcing the dispersal draft and then there needing to be also a signing process as well. I don't think that'll ever happen.
Right. But I will say, I think we're happy to see that a whole bunch of players that probably got really screwed over by this whole, obviously, it was many of the things out of the control of people here in terms of the Toronto folding, in terms of New York folding.
Yeah.
And just, some players obviously getting put in a really, really difficult spot with the foldings of those two teams and not having a home for the 2024 year. But to see kind of some of these guys as we kind of pan out here and signings will continue to happen, that at least these guys are finding homes here.
And
There's gonna and ultimately I think it's making, like you said, Matt, a lot of these teams better. There are a lot of players that are going to different sides here that are kind of, filling the gaps here, and it should be interesting when we get into these teams here, this early outlook for some of these squads.
I will say that unfortunately, I think that this has probably, unfortunately, is probably a little bit of a sad thing for some of the, especially Toronto Arrows guys and maybe some of the Rugby New York guys, of that these guys who didn't get drafted, guys who haven't gotten signed yet, we may not see them in the MLR in the near future. And that's too bad. But, like you said, Ryan, I think they've taken the best from those teams, and it's been spread across the league pretty well.
All right. Well, let's start getting into some of these players and where these new faces have ended up on these
Ryan,
new teams.
Before we do that, can I just say something really quick? And I kind of mentioned this early, but so I think, I don't know what happened, right? But they took it took a team like the Rugby New York Football Club or the Rugby New York Ironworkers or the Rugby, what else were they called, Ryan? The Rugby FC LA. No, that's this stupid team that came in. Ryan, LA possibly has the worst team name of all time. I don't know what they're thinking, but the usual is city or town.
Yeah.
RFC, Rugby Football Club. It's very simple. You go across the entire world. You look at every, city name, town name, Rugby Football Club.
Yeah.
LA, just because you're in California doesn't mean you have to be different. You don't have to call yourself Rugby Los Angeles Football Club Los Angeles, okay? That you didn't need to do that. And I don't even, apparently your logo is an acorn. It's not. It's a male genitalia, okay? It is a male genitalia with an A, and you put the A in as like an homage to the Atlanta. Why do you have to homage the Atlanta? Like, you don't have to. You could have come up with something better. This is possibly, Ryan, and LA continues with this trend that they continue to come up with the worst names in the MLR. And it's going to be continuing from 2024 and beyond.
Well, I was going to save the conversation until we got to previewing this Rugby FCLA
I had to. I couldn't.
But you got to get off your chest. I understand. But yeah, I mean, let's get into it. The whole announcement, obviously, we were talking about it a lot on this show about kind of when are they going to be announcing this team? When are they going to be announcing the branding and all this stuff? And your reaction and of seeing kind of how it all unfolded and seeing the team, Rugby Football Club Los Angeles. Yeah, not the best. Not the best. They're known as at Rugby FCLA. I guess that kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit. The colors are okay. I mean, this dark blue, baby blue type look that they got going. But yeah, I mean, the name, don't love it. The logo, don't like it even more. But I mean, what can you do? I think at this point in the when it comes to being an MLR fan, we're just happy that there was an announcement of some sort. But you would have thought that with the amount of time that they took to kind of announce this thing, that it would have been some next level branding.
It took them.
I think they missed the ball on that.
6 months, and they looked at a page and they said, "Rugby Football Club Los Angeles."
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Male genitalia? Yep. That's it. Look, they're the LA Richards now, and that's just the way it is.
The L.A. Richards. Yeah, I mean it was a tough one, but again, I mean at this point as an MLR fan, I'm not gonna complain.
Ryan,
That's the
maybe
point
that
where we're at.
yeah.
But I mean, yes,
Maybe that's a
not
good
the best.
segue. We start off with the newest team in the league.
Okay,
Well,
let's do
maybe
it.
the second newest team in the league. The LA Richards.
Let's let's start getting into it then. Yeah, let's begin our little outlook, and yeah, let's start off with Rugby Football Club Los Angeles here,
Yuck.
and the squad that they have outside of the branding and outside of the colors and the name.
Yeah.
I mean, it's when I saw them release their roster, they've brought a solid amount of number of names from the Rugby Atlanta squad
Yep.
that were some marquee names there, while
Hmm.
adding some pretty solid talent from the dispersal draft and from other avenues. I mean, you look at some of the returning names that were on Rugby Atlanta. You have Jason Dam, you got Yuri Van Vuren returning, Alex Mon, these guys that were kind of big names of this. Niall Saunders in that list, and then you add that with the addition of the moves that they were able to make with the acquisition of Jordan Chait over the offseason, and then you
Hmm.
add guys like Jason Emery and Andrew Coe through the dispersal draft, not to mention guys like Will Leonard that are staying around, Jack Shaw that were on Rugby Atlanta. I mean, pretty solid base as a first year Rugby Football Club Los Angeles squad here heading into the 2024 year.
Yeah. No, they definitely have a nice little squad there. I definitely like their back line a bit more than I like their forwards. Looking at the roster now, I mean, you pointed out a couple guys, Coe, obviously, Jason Emery, Will Leonard, I think is
Hmm.
going to be a nice little play here as well. Well, the one guy that I would really look for is Jordan Chait. I think, he's last year, if anything, we showed that he deserves a starting role in this
Hmm.
league. And I think he's a great kind of playmaker to build your team around. Um, I think looking at this though, I think they'll struggle this year. I think they're going to have some tough times, not because their team's bad, not because they don't have talent. I think it's just when you look around the league and you look at the talent that has been built around the league, um, it's just on another level. And I'm surprised that LA wasn't able to pull in more international talent
Mm.
to their team, similar to the way the Guiltinis did. I wonder if the San Diego Legion has almost taken away that LA glitz and glamour because of this whole shambles that they were in order to announce it all. And maybe players were unsure of what this team was going to be.
Hmm.
And San Diego Legion was just something that and they've been consistent in the MLR. They've had guys and they're you didn't have any questions with them basically. So that's my kind of takeaway for me. I think they have some really good core guys. I like their backline again a lot better than I like their forwards. Not that their forwards are bad. I mean, they still got Matt Heaton, guys like Yuri Van Vuren, Regan O'Gorman. But that just doesn't compare to the rest of the franchise in the league.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I think they will struggle this year though.
And I mean, I don't know how much of that has to do with them being a new franchise and I guess how long it took them to kind of get things sorted out. Again, we aren't in the backroom conversations, and I don't know how long roster construction kind of discussions
Yeah,
were it took them to get to that point after developing this franchise. But yeah, I mean, it could be a lot worse, I think, is the my kind of initial
for sure.
reaction to with the lack of kind of news that we were hearing about this Los Angeles team. That I was kind of worried on what kind of side that they were going to be putting out here in 2024. It could be a lot worse. I think I agree with you, Matt. It's a team that's going to struggle, I think, but I think they do have high caliber players, like Jordan Chait, like Will Leonard, like Andrew Coe, like Jason Emery, like Yuri Van Vuren, guys that are established here in the league that will be able to lift them up. From a
Yeah,
fantasy perspective, I'm looking at any of those guys, right? I'm excited to see what Jordan Chait offers. He's obviously gonna, if you look at that fly half depth chart, he's going to be the guy there. So he should have a lot of kicking and scoring opportunities, a lot of playmaking opportunities. We'll see how
yep.
much Jason Emery. I know he played a bulk of his season last year at the fly half position for New York, but it looks like they'll be using him at that center position, his natural center playing position,
Mhm.
alongside Will Leonard. Maybe that has something to do with the development of Seth Purdy and how he kind of gets through
Yep.
here. And then Andrew Coe is going to be a guy that I'm looking at, and some of those backline forwards. But again, I think this is not like you mentioned, Matt, like a San Diego team or a New England Free Jacks team where I want a piece of every single little bit of this Rugby Football Club Los Angeles
Yeah,
squad for fantasy. There are guys that I'm going to select and choose because of their skill level and because of the opportunity that they're going to get, and then
yeah,
I'll look elsewhere for some other positions.
yeah. You're gonna pick the guys that are gonna perform. And starters like Niall Saunders is a guy that I would bring up as he's the clear starter at the
Hmm.
scrum half position as of right now. Um, and he's shown to perform in the past and in the MLR, so I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being a suitable 9 to be on your fantasy team.
All right. Well, let's shift on over to last year's newest team, and let's get on over to the Chicago Hounds. And this is a team, is an interesting one because I feel like I'm going to fall in the same trap of what I did last year about being excited for this team
Well,
when I don't know if I should be excited for them. Obviously, there was a
I don't
whole
think
lot
it's
of
a
hype.
trap this year, Rye.
I think that last year, obviously, there was a lot of names that were with the Chicago Hounds team, especially after the dispersal draft last year, where I was like, oh man, I'm all aboard the Chicago Hounds team. Maybe it's a
Ryan,
little bit of buyer's remorse and just being a
yeah,
little bit hesitant, but this year, I think
no,
I'm
it's
buying in again. They
Ryan.
have some names here, man.
This is not the same team. I mean, yes, we looked at last year's team and we thought, wow, how can this team not be good? But I think there were clear gaps last year. 9 position,
Hmm.
clear gap. 10 position, clear gap. Um, and I think they had some struggles in the forwards as well. This year, bringing in guys like Dylan Fawcett, bringing in a guy like Nick McCarthy, Adrian Carles closes that gap.
Yeah,
Dave Carney, Nate Oxberger. I mean, this is a whole different team. Their whole starting lineup is going to change.
yeah.
Um, and I think that this team. I mean, I didn't even mention Lucas Rumble, Captain Canada, but yeah, I think this is a team that you can jump on. No, they might not be. They're still. I think that you compare them to the San Diego Legions and New England Free Jacks of the league. Yes, I don't think they're there yet, but they're not going to be the Chicago Hounds of last year.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk about some of these guys that were added. Obviously, Nate Oxberger was probably one of their biggest
Yeah.
acquisitions coming in. He got drafted by the NOLA Gold with that 6th pick, ended up not re-signing with them. There was rumors, I think, heading into the offseason or during the offseason when New York was still around, that Nate Oxberg was going to become a New York
And he
Ironworker, I
was
believe.
technically drafted from there. So yeah.
And he was technically drafted from there. So there was that situation, which is also kind of weird because there was no talks between the moves from
No.
San Diego to New York. But nonetheless, Nate Oxberger ultimately sticking with Chicago and going elsewhere other than the NOLA Gold. They add again Adrian Carles during the offseason there, Lucas Rumble through the
Yep.
dispersal draft, which is massive, and Dylan Fawcett signing with the Chicago Hounds as well. I love these new names on this list. And
Yeah.
and I think, again, I think the same sentiment with you, Matt. I don't think they've necessarily quite reached that tip top tier of the MLR like the New England Free Jacks and like the San Diego Legions yet. But this is a huge step up,
Yeah.
at least on paper, from where they were last year,
Yeah.
and they filled in a lot of holes. This is a team that I'm starting to get into that space where, and I'll admit, I fell for it last year where I was like, I just want a piece of the Chicago Hounds offense. I want a piece of the points that this team's going to score. This year, I know it's hard to kind of get back on the bandwagon again, but I think this year I'm even that much more confident that I want a piece of the Chicago Hounds offense in this upcoming fantasy season.
Yeah. No, I mean, last year, towards the end of the year, we are definitely at the point of like, all right, there's like 4 or 5 guys on the Chicago Hounds team that you're willing to pick up and you're willing to start. The rest of the guys, you're staying away. This year, I mean, you can have a guy in every position that you'd be willing to
I was
play.
just gonna
Front row,
say, yeah.
Dylan Fawcett. Second row, Brad Tucker or Ben Landry. Back row, potentially Lucas Rumble. But, I think back row is maybe one of their weaker sides in terms of fantasy output. Just because Lucas Rumble's last year
we could see Rumble take a step back, and I mean Mike Matarazzo has been good in the past too. So
For sure.
yeah, no, absolutely.
For sure. Nick McCarthy at the scrum half position, Adrian Carrell at the fly half position, centers. I mean, take your pick, right?
Right.
Like Bryce Campbell or Billy Meeks. I think maybe Mark O'Keefe gets some time back on the wing. depending on how much Dave Carney plays. But and back three, I mean, Julian Dominguez and Nate Oxberg are those two guys that are always going to be on starting
Yeah.
squad. So to your point, Ryan, I mean, I think this team's got some offensive firepower. I think this team's going to put it together this year. I think they'll be like a middle of the pack team and guys who you're not going to completely write off every time a team plays them.
All right. Well, let's shift on over now to another team that kind of struggled a little bit last year, but there was some optimism behind them in certain performances. But the Dallas Jackals
Yeah.
coming in. This was a team that I feel like has made improvements, but hasn't
Yeah.
necessarily added too much here. I think they're coming in with a
Yeah.
lot of the same. You have a couple new names. You have Ronan Foley, who's coming in here, which should make a big addition to that back row room that was already pretty strong here for the Dallas Jackals. Obviously, Sam Galla and what he was able to do last year. You'll see what, Thomas Kubia, what he was able to do towards the tail end of last season, to see what a full MLR 2024 campaign is going to provide him, especially from a fantasy output. But I mean, I think Chicago has jumped way ahead of the Dallas Jackals here. I'm not too optimistic about the Dallas of this Jackal squad. I think they're still going to be towards the bottom, of this MLR table. But I guess I'll be proven wrong if they do differently here. But there just isn't,
Yeah.
with the number of changes that have happened on other teams. There hasn't been that same amount of acquisition level with this Dallas Jackals squad.
Interesting. I'm going to call out an interesting guy who's missing from there. It's Adrian Boyson.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
We look at that back row room and a guy who was so important to the Dallas Jackals last year, fantasy wise especially, is like
the tackle is crazy.
You're missing Adrian Boyson now, and so you look at this team of like, all right, can Ronan Foley fill that void? They're two different types of players, in my opinion, and you're going to expect something different from Ronan Foley that you would from Ian Boyson. But yeah, I'm on the same boat, right? I think, yes, they brought in some guys. I think the guys that they brought in are not necessarily, in my mind, game changers. I don't think they put this team ahead of anybody else outside of maybe LARFC. And I'm going to say also potentially Old Glory DC. But yeah, I don't, there's not too many guys. Like, to me, I think their strongest position here is going to be center position and Sam Galla.
Yeah.
And he's just a position on his own.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Sam Galla, again, last year was the highest scoring rookie in fantasy perspective, 135.6 fantasy points last season. And again, such a game breaker when it came to having a guy like that at the second row position. I think the sentiment with this Dallas Jackals team remains the same, at least for now, heading into this 2024 fantasy season, where you're like, okay, kind of the same sentiment with the LA team. Like, there are guys on here that you'll pick. There are guys on here that are going to get opportunities. So I think, I throw on Sam Galla. There's a guy you're going to want. Thomas Kubia is probably a guy that you're going to want. Ronan Foley, if he can return to the same form that we've seen him before, he's probably a guy that you're going to want. And then there's going to be starting guys that may be streamers, whoever starts at fly half, whoever starts at scrum half that you may, stream on a week-to-week basis, whoever kind of emerges from the back three maybe. But again, kind of the same tier as the Los Angeles Rugby team that's you're going to pick and choose here with this Dallas Jackal squad for sure. All right, shifting on over to another Texas team. Let's talk about the Houston SaberCats. This is going to be an interesting one. I mean, they have made additions here that are exciting. AJ Alatimu is now a Houston SaberCat, which is really, really weird to think about because, he's been a staple of that Seattle Seawolves side for so long. They added Tuala Tasi to this squad too. It should be an interesting one here. Johan Mumsen is now a part of the Houston SaberCats as well. This should be a fun team to watch.
Yeah, this is, I mean, you just look at, for me, like, you look at that back, like the back line, and it just looks ridiculous. I mean, you look at guys like AJ Alatimu and Davy Coetzer. You look at Tuala Tasi, Dom McKenna, Lourdes Vanderskip, and Sam Hill. I mean, that center room alone and is something that you love to have. I mean, Sam Hill, I think, is going to be a starter, and then Dom McKenna potentially, or Lourdes Vanderskip. And then the back three, I mean, Jerry Labuschagne, Christian Dyer, Drew Wild are three guys that have been high performers in this league.
Mm-hmm.
I really like that back line. I really like any of those back three guys. I would take their centers as well. I'm a big fan of their centers. And obviously, the one concern here is like fly half wise, you got to make a decision as a fantasy manager.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like you got to make a decision on, do you need to pick both of these guys up in order to manage when one guy starts and when one guy doesn't?
Mm-hmm.
What does this look like? We saw the same thing in Seattle last year, right? We saw the same thing with AJ Alatimu. We saw the same thing with Jordan Chait. One guy gets hot, and all of a sudden you don't have that one guy.
Right.
That's an issue. Like that's tough. You're spending draft capital on one of these guys. There's no doubt both of these guys are going to get drafted. It's just a matter of, do you have to spend 2 draft capitals, right? Like you have to spend 2 picks
Right.
if you want to pick one of them.
And I mean, these were guys that were high performers. I mean, Davey Coates, 185.5 fantasy points last season for Houston. He had the position on lock there. Starting in 13 of the games that he played in, 7 tries. Just a monster from that fly half position. Not to mention the 33 conversion kicks. What was really what propelled him to be at the top of that fly half list. 7 penalty kicks to add on top of that. And then I mean, AJ Alatimu. We've seen what he's done before with the Seattle Seawolves. Last year was kind of a down year for him. There was a reason why AJ Alatimu was so highly sought off in our 2023 draft going into it, because he was just so electric when it came to the Seattle Seawolves. Obviously, Jordan Chait had an impact in that in 2023. He played a little bit more at that center position. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how you kind of play that role. Kind of when you contrast that with kind of the Chicago Hounds, and kind of how, you're pretty confident with the Chicago Hounds team in terms of who's going to be starting there at the fly half position with Adrian Carles there. But with Houston, you're kind of more a little bit, up in the air, and you don't know where the fantasy production is going to be there. With a line like this, with the back line like this, you're confident that there's going to be fantasy points here. It's just trying to figure out who's going to be scoring those fantasy points.
Well, I actually think, Chicago's in a similar position in terms of, like, Luke Hardy, he had a decent season last year. He was okay. I know I was a critic of him last year for sure. But the difference here is that I could see Luke Hardy passing through the draft, right?
Right.
Davey Coates and AJ Alatimu are no way both going through the whole draft, right? Like, both of those guys are going to be high draft picks. Like, and it's not just like, oh, I can maybe like Luke Hardy, even Adrian Carles, like you could probably get them in the later rounds. AJ Alatimu, David Coates, these guys are going to be, latest 9th, like latest 8th round maybe, or 7th round. And it's like, how do you manage that? What do you do? Like, as a fantasy manager, how do you manage this type of lineup? Because we saw it with Seattle that you end up with one of them and you can get bit. Like, it's just going to happen.
If you had to pick right now, who are you going with? If you were given, you only can have one. Who are you going with right now? I got to say Davey Coates.
Yeah, I think Davey Coates has the...
He's been with Houston.
He was a try scorer last year.
Right.
Like, he was the try scoring 10 of the league last year. And yes, maybe he starts half the games he did last year, 3/4 of the games he did that. But at least he's got the upside. AJ Alatimu, I mean, he requires the ability to play.
Yeah.
He's a playmaker. He's a guy who's going to do it off the boot. So he needs that. And I know that he got some playing time last year for Seattle at 12. I don't think he has a space here at 12 on this team. So, yeah, I would go Davey Coates, I think.
Gotcha. All right, well, let's shift on over now to the second newest team of the MLR, the Miami Sharks. And this is a team that I think you can get pretty excited about, because there's a lot of names here that are pretty fun to see. I mean, we've been talking about, Thomas Kubeli and kind of their initial kind of start of building the franchise around him. And then you add, certain guys on this list that should be a whole bunch of fun to watch. Eric Naposki on here, Benjamin Bonasso in the back row as well, Dan Pryor, Sean McNulty in that front row at the hooker position. We'll see if he can kind of make a comeback into form here. But if I had to choose, between the Miami Sharks and the Los Angeles Rugby Football Club, it's
Easy
an
decision.
interesting one here in terms of who's kind of starting off with the better base.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Miami had the tough one. I think Nico Sanchez decided that he wasn't going to come to Miami. I don't know if we already talked about this, but wasn't going to come to Miami, and he's going to, I believe, to play in Japan. But then they pick up, a guy like a Uruguayan Felipe Echeverri, was great, who's been great for Uruguay in his 20 caps.
Mm-hmm.
And they still have guys like Thomas Kubeli. I mean, you look across this team, and you see a somewhat of a star or some sort of star in every position, right? Like you look at the front row, you look at Rob Evans, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at the second row, yeah, okay, maybe that's a softer point for them. The back row, they pick up Dan Pryor, right? They got Benjamin Benasso. The scrum half position, Thomas Cabelli, Felipe Echeverri at the fly half position. We'll see how he does. I actually think he's going to be electric this year in the MLR, so he's going to be a guy to watch for on this team. And you look at like Nick Griggs, right? And then in the back three, yeah, maybe you don't have that same star-studded power as some of the other teams, but it's
recognizable names.
It's nothing to scoff at, right? Like Marcos Young, Matthias Fryer, Avery Orderman, Eric Naposki, we've definitely seen him be a little bit of a highlight reel. So I think Miami is looking good this year. I don't think that they're going to necessarily be like first season in, we're going to be top 4.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'll be middle of the pack. I think they'll be above LARFC or the LA Richards. Yes. I think they'll be above the LA Richards. I think they'll be above Dallas. And then I think they'll be fighting with Old Glory DC for some of the spots in the bottom 4 or bottom bottom 6.
Of shout. I guess we'll get into Old Glory there in a bet there. I didn't expect that thing. But for me, I think it's a little bit trickier. I don't know. If you're a general manager right now and you had the option of starting an MLR franchise with the Miami Sharks roster or the LA roster, you're picking the Miami Sharks roster?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I just think that they have. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think you look at the LARC. Yes, they have some star guys. I think their backline is probably similar to Miami on skill level wise, maybe even better. But I just think that Miami has made some key pickups and international pickups this year that is going to put them and help them put them over the top.
All right, well,
LARFC just wasn't able to do that.
Let's make this a little bit of fun then. I don't know what the bet is going to be for, but I think during the season, if we're going to do the race of the newest teams, the MLR, I think I'm going to say that LA finishes higher than Miami here. So I know you don't like the logo or the name, but I'll bite the bullet there and back I think the roster and our friend of the show Andrew Coe on that squad and see if LA is able to get higher than Miami.
Fair enough. And I'm going Miami, and neither of us are going Charlotte. So
yeah, no kidding. All right, well, let's shift on over. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this team. They announced their roster really, really early. Obviously, the class of the MLR, the New England Free Jacks, really not many changes here heading into this year. Really the same squad outside of maybe a couple additions here, but some of the big names again. John Poland is coming back, Jason Potros, Reese McDonald, LaRue Malen. Hopefully he'll be back from that injury that he sustained in the World Cup. But they have Wayne Vanderbank, they have Ben Lesage, Mitch Wilson, Paulo Belcana in that back row line, and then of course Vian Conradi, Cam Davidovitz, just a lot of recognizable names here from the 2023 MLR champions. And there was no surprise that they came back with basically the same names. The addition of Kyle Bailey should help as well. But I mean, the New England Free Jacks, they're going to be the team to beat here going into the 2024 year. And I don't think there's much to be said. From a fantasy perspective, I want pieces of all of this. I want Andrew Quattrin. I want, even Kyle Bailey, I think is going to do great here. Vian Conradi, obviously one of the best back row scorers from a fantasy perspective all season long. Best one at 193.8 fantasy points. And then, of course, Matt, you had Jason Potros on your team, and you knew what he did from a fantasy perspective on an offense like this. He's going to be electric as well. And then you have the centers there. I mean, the New England Free Jacks, again, I don't think we need to spend too much time on this. They're, again, going to be kind of the marquee of the list.
Yeah, look, they lose. I think the big loss is Mil Sanarivi.
Yep.
But you follow it up with Quattrin, who is not that far behind in terms of performance.
Mm-hmm.
So that fills that gap. I think they've added some depth this offseason. I think, they've kept a lot of their core. I mean, obviously they talked about it that they have one of the best retention rates in the league or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
which you can clearly see here. So yeah, they're going to be going for a repeat. They're going to be going for another one. They have the team to go for another championship. It's just a matter of, even though you're going with the whole process of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, have some of these other teams who have made some big pickups.
It's true.
Now surpassed you because of their need to go pick up more players.
And I've learned, and I've asked myself that question as well, Maddie, but I've learned with this New England Free Jacks side, with the consistency that they've been able to show in the time that they've been in the MLR,
Yeah.
I ain't doubting this New England Free Jacks team. I might be
That's
scared
true.
with some of the roster moves that some of these other teams to kind of close the gap with this Free Jacks squad, but I mean, just how
Yeah.
consistent these guys are. It's going to be interesting to see how
Agreed.
if they're able to do it again here.
I think, yeah, and just as we wrap it up on the New England Free Jacks, I'm just gonna bring it like, nobody's sleeping on Reese McDonald next year. Nobody's sleeping on Jason Potros. We saw both those guys; they can both have impact. Reese McDonald at 15 is going to have an impact, whether he plays at 10 or not, and most likely won't play at 10. And once LaRue Milan is back, and hopefully LaRue Milan's back for the season, nobody's going to sleep on him either. There's no injury kind of stunting his performance, so we can hope that he has one of the best center performances in the league by the end of the year.
All right. Well, let's shift on over now to the NOLA Gold. Talk about a team that has made some moves.
Sorry,
here.
right. Last one. Quatrin's going to be huge.
Yeah, Quatrin is.
Quatrin's going to be huge for this team, both for this team and for fantasy.
Absolutely. All right. Let's shift on over now to the NOLA Gold, who is a team that has made a significant amount of moves here this offseason. I know, Matt, you were on the NOLA Gold.
Be jumping on the same train this year.
Is that so? You're buying another ticket and you're going back on the
buying another ticket. I'm going into the gold mine. I'm going in there. I'm gonna get some cancerous toxins from the gold mines, and I'm gonna go in there hoping for success because this team is looking sweet.
Looking pretty good. I mean, you add obviously the biggest name probably this offseason is Ed Fido and the dispersal draft, adding to that back three of Jordan Trainer, Dougie Fife, some of the other big names there. A center room that's pretty locked up with JP Duplessis and Jordan Jackson Hope with what they were able to do last year. Duplessis being one of the top fantasy scorers for us last season. 204.2 fantasy points, the best center overall in the fantasy 2023 year. Rodney Iona is going to be back. Luke Campbell should continue to make his name in the MLR, and then you add some of those names in the front pack as well. Yeah, I mean, NOLA Gold should be pretty solid, right?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I look at this is they've their forward pack is okay. It's decent. They've got the big guys like Jared Adams is obviously going to be big for them. They brought back Malcolm May, who's always been good. But where I look at this team is like the back line. The back line is just silly now. And we've seen Ed Fido be a game changer for teams. But you look at this like Luke Campbell, Rodney Iona, JP Duplessis, Jordan Jackson Hope, Ed Fido, Dougie Fife, like Jordan Trainer. That back line just seems ridiculous. And I think one of the biggest issues they had last year was that they just at times weren't able to get go forward ball. And I think this back line kind of allows them to get a little bit more of that, play a little bit more. And I think they're going to be a good team this year.
Yeah, should be interesting. Is this your favorite back line so far out of the teams that we broke down?
So far, yes, but I'm kind of biased because my love for JP Duplessis. Yeah, I think this is the Houston. No, Houston. I think is the best one that we've gone through so far.
Okay,
NOLA Gold maybe next, but there's some back lines that are coming up. Oh, and then New England Free Jacks. Obviously, we went through them too, so. It's kind of tough. I mean, I don't think NOLA Gold's going to be. I don't think they're going to be winning the league, Ryan. I don't think they're going to be going for.
So you're not going as far as saying they're going to be MLR champions like you did last.
No. I'm not saying they're going to be MLR champions, but they're going to make it to the playoffs. Like they're definitely going to make it to the playoffs this year. I don't think they're going to be as disappointing as they were last year.
Well, I guess we'll see. I think a big thing here, which is, I mean, a good sentiment to kind of talk about with another edition of a pretty high powered backline is like that's what it sounds like we're going to the 2024 year with like a lot of improved backline play, which makes for exciting rugby. So that should be fun to watch,
Yeah,
and then
well, maybe that.
it translates to a lot of fantasy points, hopefully.
Yeah, maybe that's just us not really being totally educated on the forward back.
It could be too. I mean, we're nine, so we just give them the ball and they just do what they need to do, and then we make
Exactly.
sure distribute it out wide. All right.
Exactly.
Let's shift on over now to Old Glory DC. Talking about the sentiment of kind of not making that many changes. Old Glory DC kind of falls into that group, and I
Oh man.
off of what you wanted to have so much more of a step forward after what was a pretty solid year last year. I don't think they have the same. They don't have the same kind of.
I just yeah.
They can't. They're not in the same position as the New England Free Jacks, where they can just sit back. The success has been there, and they can just rely on that same consistency. There needed to be improvements made. It was a successful season to build off of last year, but I just don't see that they've made the additions and the changes that have been needed to keep up with the rest of the league to push them forward in positive progress here. I think
Yeah.
they might be they left behind in the dust here because of the lack of moves that they made in this offseason.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think they lost guys, obviously, and they haven't really filled all those gaps. I mean, you look at a guy like it's slipping my mind. I'm gonna look it up, but yeah, I just think that they don't. You just look at the squad and you don't get the feeling. You compare them to some of these other teams in the league, and you just don't see where it's gonna work out for them. And that's why I was looking and I was looking at this team of saying like, I think they're gonna be bottom four. Like you look at this squad and I think they're gonna be bottom four. Is Tusi like? There's questions on whether Tusi Tala is the same as when he was. Can he drive this team forward? Can he be the attacking force and be kind of the catalyst on offense for this team? Right? They lose Tito Diaz-Bonilla. They replace him with Jason Robertson. So yes, I see Jason Robertson as the starting fly-half for this squad. I think that'll be a great little fantasy play. But you look at the rest of the squad and like, all right, the back three, I've seen a lot better in this league. You look at the centers, William Talatena, okay, I've seen a lot better in this league. Mm-hmm. They've obviously got a couple additions that they still need to make in that center position, but still, it's not anything to really say like be wowed at. I think their best part of their team is probably their back row with Jameson Fanana Schultz, like Fanana Banana and Corey Daniel and Luataro Bavaro, and you got Colin Gross in the second row. But other than that, I mean, I think this team's going to struggle this year against some very strong opponents.
It just feels like a lot of other teams have made some big moves. I think Old Glory DC had a lot to build off of from a good 2023 year. I'm just not impressed with what they were able to do. So we'll see. I mean, Jason Robertson coming back. We'll see what he's able to do. I think fantasy-wise, he's going to be great.
Coming from the NPC, right?
Yes. Danny Tusitala.
It's got question marks, right? Tusitala's got question marks.
It's true.
And
it's true.
not just playing wise, but fantasy wise as well. Like you talk about the shell shocked of drafting a Danny Tusitala in the first round. Like you drafted him in the first round and you got nothing compared to what he could have been at.
Sure.
Right? Like it was not what you expected. Yeah, maybe he had a decent season, but it wasn't what you wanted. It wasn't what you drafted him for.
Right.
And you're gonna have questions of whether, hey, is he gonna be the Danny Tusitala of 2 seasons ago? Or is he gonna be the Danny Tusitala of last season? Because those are two very different rankings.
Right. All right, well, let's shift on over to a team that had a great 2023 year, ended up going to the finals, lost to New England Free Jacks. That is the San Diego Legion.
Right.
And this is an interesting one.
This team is dumb.
Okay, I agree with you, but I think there's also a level of concern, though, I will say, with the San Diego Legion team, because they've had departures, right? They've had departures. Are the guys that they've brought in able to fill that out? I mean, you bring in Matt Gateau, somehow comes out of retirement, and all of a sudden
I don't understand this guy. He was
He
running a
comes back in.
podcast
Obviously,
like
the
two
last team
months
we've
ago.
seen him is the LA Giltinis. But you have, Lincoln McClutchy there that we talked about before on the show here. Thomas Awake, who had a great fantasy season last year, ended up being
Yeah.
our number one, or not, sorry, not our number one, but our one of those top guys towards the tail end of the season. 186.6 fantasy points there for the 2023 year. You lose Samuel Malolo, but you bring in Hugh Roach and see what he
Yep.
can do there. There you lose, Judd. I don't know what the scrum half situation is looking there. We talked about Nick Boyer not being the answer there. They bring in Danny Christensen. Is that
Yeah,
going to
he's
be the
definitely
answer?
not the answer. He's definitely not.
And so we'll see there. But your overall thought, you seem to be pretty hyped about the San Diego Legion squad.
Look, I mean, face value, I think you see some obvious gaps. Like they lost Nate Oxberger. They did not replace Nate Oxberger.
Right.
You can't replace Nate Oxberger unless you get one of those marquee guys. You look at the scrum half position, right? They lost Richard Judd up the Hurricanes, but they lost Richard Judd and they replaced him with a couple young guys from overseas like Nick Duffy, Connor Tupai. You don't know what you're going to get from them. It's definitely not going to be at the same class and experience as Richard Judd. So you're confused there. But here's where I look at this, right? Like you look at the front row position, it almost remains unchanged.
Yeah.
Other than
but
Sam
Samuel Malolo is
Malolo,
a big loss.
right? But I think you bring in Hugh Roach and Chris Mickelson both. I mean, Hugh Roach, we've seen the league. Chris Mickelson's a new young guy from Australia. I think we're going to see that impact still there.
Okay.
Maybe not to the same level, but I think we'll still see it there. You bring back Isaac Ross, which is great to see. And then you look at the back row. I mean, Christian Boydevin, he didn't even have a full season last year.
And he was
gonna be
electric when
silly,
he was on the field
right?
for fantasy.
Exactly.
Like, he was great.
Yeah, Tupo Afungia, right? Tavita Tamalau, all these guys, I think they've kept the core together. And then they add guys. Like, I think we had a big question last year for San Diego of like the 10 position.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Josh Henderson filled in. And yes, Will Hooley filled in and had solid play. But now you bring in guys like Lincoln McClutchy, right? You bring in guys like Matt Gateau, who, by the way, I think will probably play at 12. But you have a guy like Lincoln McClutchy who played so well in the NPC Bunnies Cup this year that you kind of expect him to have an even better season in the MLR. So I think that's going to be that's an underrated addition that I think is going to turn into like one of those Jason Potros's additions.
Okay.
And then you have a guy like I like this team. I think they've lost star power, but they've gained in a little bit more of depth across the board.
Okay.
Are they better than they were last year?
That was going to be my question. Is this San Diego team better than what they are last year?
No. I don't think they're
I
better
agree.
than what they were last year. Just because I think they lost the two guys that were probably the three guys that were probably the most important to their success.
Right. I mean, that was the sentiment for me with this team. I think I'm still excited about the San Diego Legion side. There's still a lot of names on this team that you're very excited about, especially from a fantasy perspective. Christian Poitevin, you're excited about. Lincoln McClutchy, you're excited about. Josh Henderson, we saw what he was able to do last year. There's always the hype around Awake in that mix as well. But I think the sentiment around this team is always going to be, at least in this outlook here, this very, very early outlook, is just departures. Losing Nate Oxberger, losing Samuel Malolo, those are guys that are hard to fill in. Losing Richard Judd, those are big key positions that are going to be difficult to fill with the amount of output that they had. But we'll see whether or not this San Diego Legion side is going to do. But still, an exciting roster construction to look across and see like that. That's where it's always funny for me to see when you see like the New England Free Jacks side. It's so hard to retain consistency when you have great level guys, and the fact that the New England Free Jacks are able to do that is insane. And the San Diego Legion, who they faced in that final, obviously dealing with a little bit more movement there. So it'll be
just before we move on, fantasy. Oh, by the way, we forgot to mention Mikey Taylor, and they did add Chris Matina.
Okay, sure.
Who is good, but again, they're not Nate Oxberger. I mean, Mikey Taylor is Mikey Taylor. Like you're not gonna. There's no replacing that barrel, so it's good that they kept him.
Interesting enough, no Ma Nanu on this list.
I mean, interesting, or like, are you like, all right, You can have Ma Nanu or you can have Matt Gateau. They probably had to make sure that Ma Nanu was
Yeah, no kidding.
retiring before they could sign Matt Gateau. But just guys that I would look at this year, Lincoln McClutchy, like I said, I think is going to be like I would draft him as one of the first few tens off the board.
Hmm.
Ethan Grayson in the centers, I would definitely take a look at him, and I would definitely look at Chris Mickelson, this hooker coming from Australia, this young man coming out of Australia. Definitely, I would take a look at him and see if potentially you would have, you could get some fancy output. I'm not talking about the guys like Christian Poitevin, like those are obvious guys, like
Right.
Tupolev Fungia, like those guys are obvious, but I would definitely take a look at those three guys for me.
All
I'll
right.
be
Well,
interested to see how they do.
let's shift on over now to the Seattle Seawolves, who tends to have a lot of fantasy output guys, and this one should be another interesting one. Again, I think they
Another
lose
dope team.
they lose their two fly halves that they had in the 2023 year,
Yeah,
and they add Mac
whatever.
Mason and Sam Windsor, which is going to be
Yeah.
fun to watch on the Seattle Seawolves. They
Look, you don't
basically
need.
retain the same center core. They have JP
Oh no,
Smith, who's
they
good.
didn't, Ryan.
Okay.
Ryan. They did not just
Oh,
retain the
well,
same
no,
center core.
they have Tavita Kuradani now.
Ryan, they could sign me at 10. And all I need to do is just give it to Tavita Kurajani the entire game. And Dan Creel. And Tavita Lopez. Yeah. Anyways, go on, Ryan. I
Yeah,
just had
so no, I agree. The Tavita Kuradani there is a huge one, and then they have the best 9 in the league in JP Smith.
Yeah.
Now, especially with the departure of Richard Judd, I think there's no question that JP Smith, at least definitely from a fantasy output, he was the best 9 that we had all year long, scoring a whole bunch of points, a total of 108 fantasy points last season, which
Yep.
was electric. And then, I mean, you look at the same front pack. There's always the Seattle Seawolves
Well,
pack that you can
they
always.
add Joe Taufetti now.
Joe Taffetti's in there now as well. Rhino Herbst is in there. At that second row, you got Nakai Penny. They add Pago Haini. It's been in and out with injury, but you keep Reichert Hadding. I mean, again, you talk about consistency, about keeping the standard of skill level on your squad high despite departures, and this is what the Seattle Seawolves have been able to do. They keep their core players that have got them so much success over the year, with Duncan Matthews, with Reichert Haddings, JP Smith, those core guys, and then
Yeah.
despite the departures of Jordan Chait and AJ Alatimu, you add guys like Mac Mason, Sam Windsor, plus the additions of Tavita Kuradani and Joe Taffetti. This is gonna be a fun team.
Look, I mean, and they bring in a second row in Hugh Taylor, an English guy from overseas to replace that Ben Landry type player. I think this team's better than that San Diego Legion team we just looked at.
I agree for sure.
I think this is going to be an early prediction of like it's New England Free Jack versus San Diego. I don't know if they're making changes to the whole division thing, but like New England Free Jack versus Seattle Seawolves, I could
agree.
see it. I could see it. You look at these two teams. Yeah, 10 position, whatever. I think Mac Mason, Sam Windsor, I think they'll both do you just fine. I think the power of this team is you look at that back row. Pago Heine, even though he gets hurt a lot, we've seen him, and Riker Hadding is,
Charles Elton.
yeah, and Nakai Penny. I mean, Devin Short.
Yeah.
Short, we've seen his impact as well, but
Yeah.
as long as Riker Hadding continues to get needles in his butt, he's going to be just fine. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, you look at this team across the board, every position, right? Like, it's just silly. The back three, they keep Duncan Matthews. We know what Inafutu does, right? They add Tony Pulu coming from overseas, from New Zealand, right? Kurajani and Dan Creel, Tavit Lopetti, like that's silly. That's a silly choice to have to make between three guys.
Yeah.
And they got JP Smith, like you said. I think this team has stepped it up from last year. Yes, maybe they've lost a few guys, but this team has definitely stepped it up. Step it up from last year, and I think they're going to be a top 2 team in the league.
I think this might be my favorite early roster outlook out of the entire league.
I agree.
This is just electric. I think out of all the rosters, this is the one that I want to have a piece of. I want to have Dan Creel or Tavita Kurdani or Tavit Lopetti on my squad.
Yeah,
I want even Mac Mason or Sam Windsor. They might not be the highest skill level guys, but the amount of playmaking and assists that they're going to be getting, and the scoring opportunities with the kicking as well.
Yeah.
With this,
and we know
this team's going to be, it's going to be great.
And we know Sam Windsor and Mac Mason both have history in the MLR of being absolutely money off the tee.
Yeah.
For me, I think the big question is like, you look at that center position and it's like, how do you go about that?
Yeah.
What's going to happen? You have questions about Tavit Lopetti has been a stud. Dan Creel is obviously Dan Creel, but then you bring in Tavita Kurajani is like, where does he fit in? Like, is he
Problems
going
to
to be
have, though.
playing every game? It's a great problem to have. Like, we were concerned with Ma'ananu coming in, but this isn't Ma'ananu. He's probably younger than Ma'ananu when he came in, maybe. But like, it'll be interesting to see how we go about that. I'll be interested to see where Tavita Kurajani gets drafted.
And
I
I
think
feel
that'll be very interesting.
right, and that's the sentiment, is that from a fantasy perspective, is who do you feel confident in out of that bunch? I think from a skill perspective, it's going to be so fun to watch Kuradani be electric in fantasy. But if I had to put my money on it, I'm sticking with Dan Creel, second best center in fantasy scoring last season, with
I think
200.4 points. But we'll see. But again,
I think it's more
overall, it's gonna be
so.
fun.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's more so who's next to Dan Creel. That's the question.
Right.
Dan Creel is not where you had the question. It's who do they play next to him and on how often. So yeah, and I would definitely let's keep Duncan Matthews. I think Tony Pulu's gonna have a really great season. I think they've tried that Connor Mooneyham train. They've seen what he can do, and they've kind of said, all right,
And
you
they saw
weren't
what Lionel
performing
Futsi
last
can
year.
do in sports too as well.
And Lionel Futsi, I think, has really made himself known. And I think Tony Pulu is going to be a great addition to that. And yeah, I think another guy on this team, Hugh Taylor, I think is going to be a starter in that second row, and I'll be interested to see how he does this year.
Great, yeah. This is the roster that I think I'm most excited about here.
Yep.
So far, at least in this early outlook. All right, last team to go over here, the Utah Warriors. Another team where you're kind of like,
Vandy
okay,
would love this.
They got names here. They added Robbie Povey through the dispersal draft. It was the only pick that they made. They have Joe Mono from last season, who was so electric. You keep some key names like Kalimakin, and you add Nick Suchon, which should be a pretty big addition for them there from Old Glory DC. Nothing to be crazy excited about, but again, kind of like that same Old Glory DC sentiment. I just like the roster better here in this situation where you got kind of your same guys, and you've added a couple pieces here and there, and it was successful last year, and we'll see whether or not it's successful this year.
Well, I mean, you love to see a guy like Nick Suchon added to the squad.
Sure.
Along with Vukoto, I think Nick Suchon replaces that Henry Bell that you had.
Mm-hmm.
They play a very similar type of stat line in terms of fantasy wise. And yeah, I mean, it's mainly unchanged. I think they have made some nice additions. Probably at that 9 position, Logan Crowley will probably be a nice little addition there. Robbie Povey is like whatever, just because you're behind Joel Hodgson, right? Like
It
it's
was
like
so good last year.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe one that we can look out for is Spencer Jones finally on a team that maybe he can get some more playing time.
I mean,
I'd be excited.
There.
Yeah, I mean, you still got Caleb McNey there. I mean, I know that they have him they have listed as Spencer Jones' back 3, but I think he'd probably be a bit more comfortable in that center position. But then again, how do you fit in that center position? You got Tyler Fisher, you got Paulo Sike, you got Mika Kruse.
Yep.
Pretty tough. I like the team. I think they're gonna have a similar season, which was a successful season last year. They're going to have a similar performance. The only issue now is that you've got some other teams that have stepped it up. You got guys like NOLA. I think Chicago, like we talked about, is going to be better. That I think are just going to step it up, and they're going to have to make sure that they continue that run. I think that you're still going to want a piece of this offense, though, right? Like Joe Mono, Mika Kruse, like Joel Hodgson, Caleb McNey. Yeah, you're still going to want a piece of this offense. And that back line, just because of how good they are.
Yeah. Again, Joe Mono was our number 1 fantasy player overall in 2023 year by a landslide. 246.7 fantasy points over Nate Oxberger, who had 228. So,
and honestly, right, like Nick Suchon and Vukoto, if If I was a fantasy manager, I'd pick up both of them.
Yeah. And then
And I would have them both. Whoever starts, you start.
Yeah, reap the fruitions of that. That should
Yeah.
be exciting. All right. Well, to wrap up this show, Matt, I know we went a little bit long here, and again, we're going to continue breaking down these rosters as the 2024 MLR season inches closer. As we get more information, we'll start breaking down more of their fantasy outlook. But teams that you're most excited about at the top of your list, I'll have to say that I got to be the most excited about Seattle. I'll throw New England Free Jacks in there because you can't, because you have to, because they're the most consistent. But I'll throw Seattle and New England Free Jacks in that first tier for me. Who's in that first tier for you?
Okay, I'm gonna put Miami because I'm excited to see how they go.
Okay.
I'm excited to see Houston, and then I'm excited to see NOLA.
Okay.
Those are the three teams that I'm looking forward to watching. Just because I would love to see what the new additions and/or completely new team, is going to perform against MLR talent and the guys and the likes of San Diego and the likes of Seattle and the likes of New England Free Jacks.
We're so gonna get bit in the butt with the Chicago team, man. It's gonna be so funny to see.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Again, electric. Though that's kind of my next tier of list. Is excited to see these next back lines: NOLA, Chicago, Houston. That's gonna be a lot of fun to watch.
If there's one thing that people know, Ryan, is that we suck at predictions. So.
Yeah, no kidding. But hey, we're back at it another year, and it's going to be
great.
We
are.
But yeah, we'll continue our breakdown of the rosters as we get closer, like I said, to the 2024 season. More fantasy information. Again, keep a lookout on our social media pages and channels and our Discord community for when we're able to open this up to the masses, because this information is going to mean a whole lot more to you if you got a stake in it here for this 2024 year in a fantasy MLR season or league that you can join. That should be just around the corner. Make sure you're checking the FantasyRuckers.com for more of these stats that we've been mentioning throughout this episode. And again, super exciting to see. I think the bottom line here is that it got pretty grim there towards the tail end of 2023, but here at the start of 2024 in this happy new year, it's getting a whole lot exciting, and we are less than 3 months away from this 2024 season. Going to be a good one. Cannot wait. Matt, anything last for the people?
Yeah, new year, new MLR. Let's get it.
All right, well, let's get it. For Matt Yee, for Ryan Yee, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, we'll be back next week for another episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
L.A. Richards.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.